Josh and Amy were avid hikers. They had already completed down scenes of trails. But this trip was special. They chose a place surrounded by eerie rumors, dark forest. People said that travelers disappeared there. Some hikers returned, but their stories were strange and incoherent. They mumbled about whispers among the trees and figures watching from the darkness. "It's just a myth," Josh said as they set up the tent. Amy glanced around nervously. The forest was truly gloomy. The trees grew too close together, barely letting any light through. There were no familiar sounds of birds chirping, no rustling grass, only the wind occasionally stirred the leaves, creating the eerie sensation that someone was whispering. They set up camp in a small clearing and lit a fire. The flames cast long shadows, and at one point, Amy thought she saw someone else among them, a tall figure standing motionless behind the trees. "Do you hear something?" she asked, listening carefully. Josh chuckled. "It's just the sounds of the forest. Relax." But relaxing was impossible. Amy woke up to a strange sound. Someone was whispering right into her ear. She sat up abruptly, her heart pounding. The tent was dark, with only a faint glow from the dying fire seeping inside. "Josh," she whispered, nudging him. But Josh didn't react. He was sleeping, turned away from her. The whispering continued. It was everywhere, like hundreds of voices speaking in an unknown language. Amy frowned. It felt as if the sound was coming from inside her own head. Finally, she unzipped the tent and peeked outside. The forest stood still. The wind had died down, making the silence even more oppressive. And then she saw them. Something was moving between the trees. Shadows, tall, thin, with unnaturally long arms. They were too dark. Even in the night, their silhouettes seemed to absorb the light. Amy felt a chilling terror crawl up her spine. "Josh," she whispered at that moment. Josh climbed out of the tent himself. He was pale, his eyes were wide open, as if he was hearing something. "They're in my head," he whispered, and suddenly he turned and sprinted into the darkness. "Josh!" Amy screamed. She rushed after him, but it was too fast. Branches whipped against her face, roots snapped at her feet. But she kept running. She could still see his figure flickering. "Ahead! Stop!" she shouted, but Josh didn't respond. Then the whispering became deafening. The voices murmured her name. "Amy, come to us." Her legs gave out, and she collapsed to her knees. When Amy opened her eyes, it was morning. She was lying on the damp ground, her clothes covered in dirt. The forest looked different and quiet, too empty. "Josh," she called. There was no answer. She returned to the clearing, but the tent was empty. The fire had long since gone out, and Josh's shoes stood nearby. Only the shoes, no tracks, nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished. Amy grabbed her phone. No signal. She ran back along the trail, hoping to find an exit, but after an hour, she realized she was going in circles. Everything around her seemed the same. "Damn it," she muttered, and then the whispering started again. Quiet, beckoning. "Amy, you're still ours." She turned around, and she saw them. Shadows. They were standing right in front of her, eyes glowing with a white, fiery light, and long, thin arms reaching out to her. That day, rescuers found the tent. Neither Josh nor Amy was there, only their belongings. And if you stop in the clearing and listen closely, you can hear the whispering. "Amy, come to us." Mike and Jenny were a couple who loved spending time in nature. This time, they decided to go on a hike in the mountains of Montana. to one of the most secluded places, Great Pine Forest. They uttered about it. Of course that it was the perfect place for those seeking peace and solitude, but also that strange things happened in these woods. However, they dismissed all these stories as mere folklore. On the first night, they camped in a clearing far from the main trail. After securing their tent and lighting a fire, they sat together, enjoying the peace of being away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Absolute silence surrounded them, and the night sky was scattered with billions of stars. But as the night went on, the forest began to feel more and more unusual. Suddenly, somewhere in the darkness, they heard a noise. At first, it was just a faint rustling, but then the sounds grew louder, as if something or someone new was approaching. Mike and Jenny fell silent and listened intently. "Do you hear that?" Jenny whispered, her face turning pale. Mike grabbed the flashlight and carefully pointed it in the direction of the sounds. He saw nothing unusual, only the dark silhouettes of trees standing in the night shadows. "It's probably just some wild animals." Mike tried to reassure her, but his own voice sounded tense. Nevertheless, the night kept growing stranger. The rustling didn't stop. At some point, they realized the sound was moving toward them, and it wasn't the noise of foxes or deer. It was something huge, heavy. Mike felt his stomach tighten with anxiety, and then, out of the darkness, a massive figure emerged. A bear, but it wasn't an ordinary bear. Its eyes burned red, and its fur wasn't black like a typical bear's. It was a grayish-brown, almost like a shadow. It moved slowly, but its steps were heavy as if the ground beneath it was compressing under its weight. Mike grabbed Jenny's hand in terror and pulled her toward the tent. Thoughts raced through his mind. They needed to get to the car and leave, but the bear seemed to already know where they were going. "Stay close to me," he whispered, pulling Jenny toward the camp. But suddenly the bear let out a roar so loud, it felt like the earth itself was shaking. The tent began to shake, and both of them frowned. See, the bear stood right in front of them, its eyes glowing brightly in the darkness. It was enormous, several times larger than a normal bear, and its paws seemed endless and terrifying. But the worst part was that it didn't move. He just stood there watching them, waiting. Mike grabbed the knife they always carried for protection against wild animals and slowly began to step back. Jenny pressed against his back, her body trembling in shock. "We have to get out of here," he said, never taking his eyes off the bear. But as soon as they tried to move, the bear rose onto its hind legs and took a step forward. Its eyes burned even brighter, and a strange smell filled the air, a sickly, rotting scent that made their stomachs turn. Mike suddenly jumped up and threw himself at Jenny. He heard something heavy crash onto the ground behind him, and when he turned around, he realized the bear was gone. It had simply dissolved into the shadows, as if it had never been there. Panicked, they quickly gathered all their gear and ran out of the forest as fast as they could. Getting back to the car was a real challenge. They had lost their bearings, and the forest seemed to be closing in around them. When they finally reached the road and drove away, Mike couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. One thing was clear: they had barely made it out alive. The next morning, as they returned to their friends and recounted their terrifying experience, they heard a story from the locals that no one dared to speak of aloud. In Great Pine Forest, there lives a bear that doesn't just hunt, it watches those who get lost in his woods and never lets them go until it's certain they are no longer a threat. But sometimes, they say, the bear doesn't leave. Instead, it takes its prey into the shadows where it becomes their master.